So today I will be talking about the various ways that men find validation in their lives. And this is highly relevant today because, as we know, there has been much talk of incels and related topics, as well as the untimely suicide of men like Anthony Bourdain, etc., etc. Now let me say at the outset that it's kind of obvious when we talk about validation that there are universals, for example, forms of validation that apply to both men and women in more or less equal measure. So, for example, praise, most people react well and positively to praise. People enjoy it. It boosts their ego. They feel good about it. Most people like praise, and so that's something that is probably universal. And I don't want to talk too much about female validation here. This might be a topic for a separate video. But today, the topic is male validation. And broadly speaking, there are two categories of validation for men. And they can, in fact, be linked to each other. That is, they exist in relation to each other, but they can also be separate. And that's a very important point. Broadly speaking, two categories. These categories are the categories of female validation, that is, the validation felt through the female, and what I call thing validation or activity validation. The validation a man achieves for himself through engagement in activities and engaging in things. Now, these things are related and they're not related, which is a bit strange, it might seem, but it's actually not. Now, let's first talk about these two forms of validation as separate categories. The validation that a man feels through female acceptance and being paid attention to by females is something very visceral, built into the system. It's instinctive. And men crave this, obviously. It's the very bare bones of male reproductive drive, male physiology, psychology, etc. And men crave this and they look for this. This is something very much related to the incel phenomenon, obviously, because many of the complaints and grievances fall very squarely within this category of seeking approval of the female, validation through the female, the boosting of the ego through the female. The other category, thing validation, as I sometimes like to call it, can constitute all kinds of things, no pun intended. It can be hobbies, it can be work, it can be all manner of things. And this can and does sometimes, often, frequently exist independently of the validation sought after by men in the form of the female. Can also be tied to reproduction. For example, a man who enjoys his work, a type of work that concomitantly leads to higher salary and status, you get the picture. This can obviously be tied into reproduction. I think, distally speaking, every man who is pursuing something, particularly work related to great levels of remuneration, tends to be operating along this axis, which is to say, he might enjoy his work and enjoy making money, but this obviously funnels into the more visceral seeking validation through the female bit or aspect of things. And this is a perfect example of the crisscrossing, where you get an activity, let's say you enjoy finance or being a lawyer, but at the same time you enjoy it but also are making lots of money, and this allows you to achieve status and the appropriate stature in the eyes of women, helping to further cement the validation sought after by you from the female, because, of course, women like men of status. Now, these things can also be separate, and I think to the extent that these things are separate, they can be either healthy or unhealthy. I think there are many men these days that tend to seek validation solely along the female axis without looking for thing validation, and far fewer men look for thing validation without the female element. And if you examine the incel phenomenon in particular, I think what you'll see, in addition to men who are very unlucky either in the looks department, social skills department, or any combination thereof, but they tend to lack, as a rule, hobbies that, or things that they do that really preoccupy their time, that really fascinate them, that really get their noggins going, that really make them want to push further into whatever avenue that might be. Because it is entirely possible, and I know several men of this caliber and of this mindset who really do not engage with female kind at all, but rather relentlessly, through curiosity, intellectual or otherwise, and just intense interest, pursue things, activities, hobbies, whatever it might be, with great zealotry, you could almost say, and find it very fulfilling, to the point that they don't even have time to think very much about females or whether females are going to validate the activity or not, which is to say they are pursuing with zeal and interest this activity very intensely, with no thought or afterthought given to the other axis, the female attention axis, and they're perfectly fine. And I think this fuels the complex of the incel phenomenon, because my impression, having looked into it a fair bit, is that most incels don't have that. And when you don't have the thing validation, or the thing preoccupation, what you end up with is the more visceral, more almost directly relatable, because hobbies and interests vary tremendously across many spectrums. Some people like woodworking, some people like art, some people like physics, computers, some people just like video games, and we get in that a bit, the video game topic. But when you don't have any of that, when your life, or for whatever reason, you have been stripped dry of that thing validation, the default mechanism, I would argue, is to fall back into the female attention-seeking validation mechanism. And that is, in many ways, a lot more difficult, because I would argue there's much more of a lottery effect there. I think most people can find something that interests them and can pursue that interest to varying degrees, whereas you're either born attractive or not. You're either born with certain social skills because personality is very heritable or not. You can improve these things to varying degrees. But in general, there are more fixed attributes here, and you tend to fixate on that. Now, if you're a man who didn't win the lottery in these departments and you don't have the thing validation, all you're left with is that, and it will become a perpetual source of frustration, anguish, depression, whatever, anger, etc., etc. And that's not very healthy. Of course, many men combine these things, do work they find personally validating, and there's a payoff in the sense that it gives them large sums of money, which women like, etc., etc., and some of them look good in addition to that, whatever. But broadly speaking, there are these two categories for men of validation, of ways of feeling self-esteem, good about themselves, etc. Now, I mentioned in my previous video on video games that, in a way, video games give that sense of achievement. Video games give men that sense of climbing up hierarchies, of making progress, of just getting ahead. And I would argue that in today's day and time, video games are the broadest category for men in general to find something to preoccupy their time that gives them a sense of self-esteem, validation, progress, advancement. I use the word general because video games tend to be accessible to everybody. However, I would say, and this is only my impression, that increasingly there's a very inflexible, formalized system of education, particularly in the United States, less so in Europe, I'd say, but particularly in the United States, that does not allow men avenues of exploration that they might otherwise have. Classic example would be a woodworking shop, or even art classes. I had art, I had to take art. I could choose between art and music. I chose art. I mean, there were these options. And Without being introduced to these types of activities, a man may never discover that he might have an aptitude for these things, an interest, or just a curiosity that he might want to pursue, that, who knows, might lead to a lifelong preoccupation with it, a lifelong involvement that's also very intense. It's entirely possible. It might not be. It could be exposed to all kinds of things. And hobbies and interests, thing validation, this is all hit or miss, because we all have different personalities. Certain things sync more with certain people. Other things don't sync well with other people. That's all well and good. It's much more chaotic than the universal, I feel validation through female approval. They're paying attention to me. They're having sex with me. Yippee, whoop-de-doo, amazing. I would argue, though, that thing validation is more potent, more long-lasting, safer, and overall healthier because you have more control over it. And it's something that, in terms of the boundaries of exploration, is, I would say, limitless, but more limitless than the female validation factor. But increasingly, I think men, in particular young men, are being deprived of this other form of validation, exploring different fields, activities, however you want to frame it, however you want to term it. And because of that, they have this, again, very formalized, ritualistic education system. They're expected to do X, Y, Z, and not really stray from that. That's all they have. And they can play video games, maybe, and I will be a defender of video games in that respect to some degree. But they're also missing out on other possibilities of things that may or may not interest them. And I think this is in part a piece of the puzzle to the incel phenomenon, more broadly, the general sense of unhappiness that is felt by men across the board. Not being able to find things that they really enjoy. And these things may or may not be work. I think it's really hit or miss with work. Some men really like their work. In my experience, work is work. When you start doing things you enjoy as work, it ceases to be enjoyment, in my experience. Might not apply to everybody, but I think as a rule that tends to be the case. So we have this problem that men, particularly young men, are not being introduced to various things or given the opportunities to learn about things. You take some of these examples I cited recently of guys living in bumblefuck Indiana in a cornfield or what have you. There's not a lot to do. They're not exposed in school to possibilities of activities they might enjoy, be it art, music, woodworking, whatever it might be. And on top of that, they don't really grow up in the household which would expose them to that, so that's bad luck, misfortune. All they're left with are video games or looking for female validation. Now, I'm not saying female validation is a bad thing per se. It's hardwired into most men, obviously. But I do think it is very much a poor metric to hang your hat on if you're looking for any type of long-term contentment. And the more you obsess about it, the less likely you're going to be content about it. I think, generally, broadly speaking, across all spectrums of society, and indeed all, you could say, hierarchical measures for men, there's a pronounced lack of pursuit of hobbies in the sense that there used to be, and more importantly, a lack of encouragement of that as an alternative to solely looking for validation and approval through female means. Of course, this is amplified by the rampant over-sexualization and sensationalizing of the interaction between the sexes through entertainment, internet, advertisements, etc. This makes it a lot worse. But I think, apart from the very rigid academic formulae that are offered at schools, there's not a lot going on being offered to young men. And I've actually seen this work pretty well, informally, of course. So this is not a scientific observation, but through documentaries I've seen where you look at inner city kids who all of a sudden, instead of having just time after school or just hanging out in the hood, are given things to do, whether it's woodworking or art or a writing workshop, they develop, some of them at least, an interest in it, and they want to pursue it, and it keeps them away from doing bad things. It keeps them off the street. It keeps them from obsessively pursuing women in a way that would be to their detriment, etc. So, yes, broadly speaking, I think there are these two forms of validation. And if we want to argue that these things need to exist in a kind of equilibrium, a sense of balance has to be there, I would say that in today's day and age, by far, and I'm not exaggerating, the balance has swung way too far into the female validation sphere of things rather than the thing validation. And something that might help is a rekindling of introducing young men in particular to different types of activities that might make them feel a sense of accomplishment and just more content with what they're doing, to the point where they won't even be bothered by the female thing. And to the extent that they do want to deal with women, this female attention will be a secondary rather than a primary, because anytime female attention is made a primary, you get problems. It's kind of the axiom, don't put the pussy on the pedestal, but it's true. Generally speaking, if you focus on other things, the women will come, if that's really what interests you. But more importantly, I think far more importantly, thing validation will make you more content overall. And we just face, in today's day and age, a dearth of accessibility to things men can do because they're not being introduced to it. All you have is the internet. That's not the same thing as taking a class or having a mentor. Mentorship's another important thing that shows you the ropes, that shows you, oh, this is how you paint, this is how you draw, this is how you sculpt, whatever it might be. This is how you write. Anyway, I think this is an important topic to touch upon, because I think it's one of the primary sources afflicting men today in terms of general discontentment, unhappiness, suicide, and the incel phenomenon. So I will check you out hopefully at a later date, and until then, take care. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.